My name is Manuel Spitschan, and I'm here for a daylight conversation with Mónica Berger González. Hi Monica, how are you doing today?
Hello Manuel, I'm doing really well, thanks.
Great, so we're at the annual conference of the Daylight Academy, this time held at the Technical University of Munich's Institute for Advanced Study in Garching, north of Munich. It's been a tremendous first day of the conference already.
Okay.
The Daylight Academy, of course, meets every year to discuss topics around daylight, and in fact, we've just come out of a session talking about one important area, which is daylight and global health. And so I think this is a good opportunity, I think, to jump into this conversation and just learn a little bit about what you do, what your research is, and what brings you to the Daylight Academy.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm traveling all the way from Guatemala, and I feel very lucky to be here. I mean, this campus is amazing. And not only that, but the level of clarity of all the scientists that come here and the diversity of disciplines is unique. So that's what brings me here each year, is this potential for cross-fertilization of different ideas from different fields than my own, because I come from medical anthropology, and I've been working on the interface of indigenous knowledge systems around health and well-being and our modern conception of epidemiology, One Health paradigms. And so the most intriguing part was to find out that, while the Western world calls One Health this integrative view of a multi-species approach to health, where sunlight is not yet in the conversation, indigenous peoples that I work with, the Maya communities in Guatemala, have daylight at the center of a concept they call Cahuilal. And Cahuilal means exactly One Health. It is the intrinsic correlation and interconnectedness of our health as humans, animals, both our domestic animals and those in the wild, plants we eat, plants we see in forests, the bugs, and the elements. So water, wind, soil, sun. And I love it that I was invited to the DLA by some of our colleagues a couple of years ago when they realized that the Maya people could bring something of, interest to the table on how they use sunlight in tons of different applications in healthcare, in their traditional systems. So basically that's what I've been researching. But the lovely part of being here is that each year I've met wonderful people. So architects, plant biologists, other epidemiologists and artists, and we have come up with joint projects to address from our different perspectives a larger understanding around health and so on. And so now I'm very thrilled to get to know you more. So I would love to hear more about all the stuff that you do as a behavioral scientist. Mm-hmm.
So maybe we should start. So I trained as a psychologist originally. I was interested in how our brain processes vision and how stimuli in the real world make up the representation of the world. And so I did an undergraduate research internship that brought me to really trying to understand how do we process from a biological perspective different things in the world. So light, shapes, forms, etc. And so what I do now is really try to understand how light exposure influences fundamental biological functions. And so what we usually do in the lab is we try to isolate light as an influence, an environmental factor, and manipulate it in such a way that we can try to uncover mechanisms in biology. Mm-hmm. And so as an example, what we sometimes do is we create light that really only exists in the lab with specific scientific tools, with the goal of then asking, how does this specific light affect, for example, how our hormones are produced, our timing of the biological clock. And so, broadly speaking, chronobiology is the discipline that looks at the biology of time, so anything related to processes that are undergoing 24-hour changes. What I'm also interested in, of course, is not only doing work in the lab, but actually leaving the lab and understanding or trying to understand what happens outside of the lab in real people in the real world. And so one of our projects looks at, for example, light exposure in day-to-day conditions over periods of time. And specifically one area that we've been exploring is collecting data of this sort, not only in Germany where we're based, but also all over the world.
You haven't been to Guatemala yet, though.
Not yet,
you
no.
Have to come.
This would be, I think it's an amazing opportunity. I think so I was actually going to ask you when you were talking about the role of sunshine. So, and I think for us, time is a really important factor when we're thinking about biology. So I was wondering, does time feature in your considerations, or do you consider daylight as kind of a instantaneous force?
So you see, the really interesting thing about all of these is how much I've had to shift my paradigms to be able to conduct research in Mesoamerica, in Guatemala. I was trained in the ETH during my PhD, and of course I was so excited to know and get all of these tools from modern science, from modern medicine. And back then we were looking at cancer research. And then I moved later into epidemiology of infectious disease, then COVID-19, but always through the lens of traditional medicine and what they were actually doing and what could we learn, right? And I came with a linear concept of time, trying to look at daylight as one of the elements that we were trying to understand, pretty much in isolation of everything else, because I think in our Western paradigm training, we become so specialized, right? We look at one thing, and then we think interdisciplinarity is so cool because we get to cross-fertilize our ideas, but we still go back to our silos. And when I was in the field work in the subtropical jungle in Petén, talking to all of these indigenous elders, I remember Tata Pablo Ash, who is elder Omanel, which is a healer. He sat me down one day and chastised me to no end and said, look, Monica, you want to do research really at equal footing, you're claiming, but you come with all your thought processes and you say you want to learn how we deal with daylight, what we think are the effects on our health, and all the questions we had, right? I had an interview guide of 200 questions. And he said, you want to understand an element in isolation of everything else. And in reality, we live in systems. Everything is interconnected. And he said, time is alive. Mm-hmm. And he said, we have a word for this called Nacht. And Nacht means time-space. And it's something that shifts depending on who's observing and who's talking. And so he was trying to explain to me that, Manuel, if you and I were to have a conversation about daylight, it would take a certain shape and a tour. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking with the elders, it's another tour. Mm-hmm. And so the concept of a time that is alive, what they were asking us to consider is to step down from our mighty horse, white horse that we usually come riding in when we do research in these settings, and actually listen and consider a different way of addressing the issue of daylight. So they said, please don't understand your Gregorian calendar. You're going to look at times, patterns, 6 a.m., when does the sun rises? And of course, we have to do that. We're trained that way. But the first thing they did was teach me the Maya calendar. So this is called the Cholq'ij calendar, and it's such a spiritual, sacred, philosophical, cosmogonic thing mixed all together with the epistemology of healing knowledge. And so I became to be really excited. I became really excited about understanding how they count days as entities that are alive, that have a personality. So there's one day called Ahpu, which represents the sun, and that's the day where you actually really have an interaction with daylight, and they go in cycles of 20 days. So this calendar is very, very complex, but what I wanted to tell you about it is that it shifted completely the way I imagined my research would go, because I had to shift the whole protocol. Mm-hmm. And so when I was hearing you, I would love to hear about your protocols in your labs and your research, because the moment you incorporate human behavior, kind of like all goes a bit to hell, like we say, you have to really be adaptive and resilient. And so with that little example of time and daylight that they shook me around, I asked the question now, how do we need to incorporate all of this uncertainty and capacity of wonder in our research? If you see my protocols now, they start with the Maya symbol of the day in the Maya calendar, because otherwise the elders won't have a conversation with me if we don't first acknowledge who is the guardian of today, what is the energy it brings. And some days we might be able to do research on plants and sunlight, and others not, because it's not the right time. And so that shift would prompt me to ask you, how do you deal in your research with all of this? Because you're also using knowledge from a lot of different topics in your own research, right?
So I think what's really interesting is I think the fundamental paradigm, I think, in modern biology is really this idea of experimental isolation. And I think the idea is you isolate one specific factor and you modulate it and you see what happens to your rhythm or your melatonin production. I think, of course, there's power in it because you can, everything else is staying constant, or so you believe, and you're just modulating the one thing. And so what we found is, of course, on paper, this all looks and sounds great, and it's a nice theoretical idea. But of course, we found, for example, that whatever people ate during the day before they came into the lab will have changed, for example, things like core body temperature or their melatonin production. And so even in this very kind of idealized experimental paradigm, you are faced with, I think, the complexity of human behavior. And I find this immensely fascinating because, of course, as researchers, we have an interest in understanding mechanisms. But I don't think we can ever understand this one factor that we've picked out when we then ask, well, what about all the other factors? So, for example, we know the biological clock that we all have in our bodies is set by the light-dark cycle, and daylight plays an immensely important role in this. Now, when we, under real-world conditions, right? So our day-to-day life, of course, the light-dark cycle is an important factor, but so is what I do during the day. When I eat, what I eat, whether I exercise or not, how well I slept, how much I slept. And so this is, I think, to me, an interesting challenge to this idea to go from one type of, I guess, biomedical evidence to then say, well, we can apply this to real people, at least in this context. I think what's really fascinating about your work is sort of this idea that there is systematic knowledge that has existed probably for a really long time that exploits daylight or uses daylight and sunlight for medical purposes. And of course, within the Daylight Academy, we're interested in understanding how we can use daylight to promote it. So I think it's a really interesting example to understand what knowledge exists, and not only what knowledge exists in the Western paradigm of medicine, but really, more globally speaking, what do we know, and what do people know?
Yeah, I would agree. And it brings me to the question of, we were discussing earlier in the groups about global health. And if we think, is our little niche research relevant at a global scale? And probably the answer is not really. But nonetheless, can we contribute something to the discussions that are ongoing? And I see that that's a very beautiful potential. When I share specificities about my research, there's always someone here at the Daylight Academy jumping with a question that makes it even more interesting. And I'll give you an example. So my goal, I work with many indigenous councils of elders. It's not just one group, and it's taken me 20 years to build the relationship and the mutual respect, so they would trust me to really go into the jungle and discover, bring to light things that have been kept secret for 2,000 years. This medical knowledge has been working for 2,000 years. Because if you're a pretty bad healer, you get thrown out of your community. It's pretty black or white. If you kill your patients, you'll never get a patient again. So healers are actually great practitioners because they're either good or they don't practice, right? And so from the Western perspective, we come to understand specific things of what they do. But what I see the dialogue brings is asking new questions for our paradigms on global health. So I'm beginning to ask the questions that we were discussing earlier. Definitely, there's something wrong with our concepts of health and well-being in the Western world. For example, the work that you do, the research that you do is unheard of in Guatemala. We don't really talk about circadian rhythms or what a lack of daylight exposure would do to you. So you go and take a job in these massive factories where you go in when there's no light yet, and you go out when it's dark, and you're not exposed to daylight, and then all of a sudden you wonder why you have a depression epidemic at the plant. But these things are not discussed because maybe sunlight is taken for granted, but there's such a cultural shift happening. So every part of the world has their little things, and I guess the question that we're asking now is, what can we learn from our individual research to bring together a global discussion centered around what does it mean to have good health and well-being, and how does daylight play a role in empowering all of these other things around us. And if I may just give like one more example concretely from my research, I was living in this little town in the middle of literally the jungle, very far, no internet connection, and so I had to bring enough supplies for a month, and I ran out of everything. And so I had to start relying on living really like the Kaqchi people live. And so if I would get sick, they would give me their plants to heal, and I had to eat their food, and I started to notice a different rhythm in me by all these changes. But when I started to walk with them in daily life, I saw a behavior that I was never going to understand in my lab in the city. So I would see a very sick animal with, it looked like squamous cell carcinoma, probably in the skin, and an elder pick up a certain plant, make a compound, and apply it, and tie the dog under sunlight. And so after a few hours, the skin had a reaction, and then he had to apply another plant to heal the wound. And so I asked them about, what are you doing? And that's how it started, the conversation about plants as photosensitizers that had these oxygen reactive species. Basically, when the sun hits the compound and the cells absorb it, it starts to heal layer by layer of the diseased skin, right? And so I thought, that's such a cool use of daylight. And I was ready to create a protocol just for researching that. But then just staying another week in the town, then I see a girl that had Chagas disease, and leishmaniasis disease, and she had this horrible ulcer in her stomach. She was bitten by a sandfly, and it was getting really big. And obviously no medicine that was available there would work, no antibiotic that they knew would work. So the same healer that treated the dog made a compound with a slightly different plant, applied it to the girl's skin, same process, and over a period of several days, the wound healed. And of course, I took that girl to the doctor after I went back to the city, and she no longer had the protozoa anywhere in the wound. So again, it's like, oh my God, there's a human medicine application, there's a veterinary medicine application, and I was ready to write another protocol, and then surprise, surprise, I see them applying the same principle to the soil. There was a pest coming to the town that was killing all of the chickens, and they said it's in the ground. I mean, the chickens defecate and they spread. And so they would make a compound with this and spread it all over the ground where the chickens dwelled to stop the pandemic from spreading. And they had this clear understanding of the cycles of daylight and the uses for humans, animals, and they disinfected their plants as well, their cardamom plants, with this thing to avoid this black fungus to spread. And so in a way, I loved this One Health approach that was intrinsic to just observing the rhythms of nature. And then I realized that there was no way I could replicate all of this in a lab, but we were going to have to compromise with taking little parts, right, as we have to do if we wanted to bring this knowledge to a science realm, like to academia.
Of course, yeah. So I'm interested, so some of these effects that you describe, you were able to replicate in the lab or to understand the mechanisms, or?
Yes, exactly. And that's what we're doing right now with other scientists from the DLA. I'm not an expert in plant science, right? So collaborating here at the Daylight Academy with others who are, I was able to send one of my students to a university in Zurich to be trained on the protocols for photodynamic therapy. And so right now we have all of these begonia species lined up to test. It took us 4 years to collect them in the forest, to find them flowering, to know what species there was. Because of course in the indigenous knowledge you just go, pick up the plant and use it. We needed to catch it while flowering, and so it took us several years to figure out when these things flower. So science takes a little longer, right, to prove in our own epistemology what indigenous people already know and use. So currently we are in the cell line part of the research. Although we've been documenting human cases as they get applied in Maya medicine and what the effects are. We've seen it used in diabetic food and all sorts of different ailments. So, it's interesting. Yeah, but I would really like to change the topic a bit and ask you more about your view from the perspective of the research you do, going back to the thing we were discussing about global health. And how do you see the trend in scientific communication in health with all of these aspects of our health with circadian rhythms and the knowledge we have? Do you see there a gap?
So it's really interesting because I think, of course, we have a good amount of knowledge of what the circadian clock is, how it's genetically determined, and various outputs. So for example, the way we can concentrate or how our metabolism works, all of this is ultimately driven by the circadian clock. And, it is generally, by many people, recognized that it is actually one of the important drivers of biology is how are organisms organized over the 24-hour cycle, or the cycle given by the Earth's rotation ultimately. And so fundamental biological mechanisms, I think we have a good amount of knowledge. And I think there's, even in the Daylight Academy, many chronobiologists who really try to pick apart influences and challenges to the circadian clock. I think the question about how do we think about this in a global health perspective is, I think there's two answers, two ways that I can think about this. The first one is, we now see a growing interest and a growing potential, in fact, for the field of circadian health and the circadian medicine, with the idea being that treatments of specific diseases and disorders should be located somewhere in time. And so, for example, we know that the efficacy of specific cancer drugs depends on the time of administration. We know also that things like light therapy, whether it's from light therapy lamps or from daylight, can alleviate symptoms of mood when it's applied in the morning, of mood disorders when it's applied in the morning. And so there is, I think, a growing concepts of circadian health and medicine. I don't think we're there yet to say there is a circadian medicine. Yeah. And I think part of this is also because of the time scales, right? So we're looking at 24 hours. And so when you're thinking about usual care, you're not thinking about, well, if I give the medication now or 1 hour later, of course you want to get it done as soon as possible, right? And so I do see a potential there. And I think when we're thinking about daylight specifically, if you're thinking about patients who are hospitalized and who might not experience the light-dark cycle as they would or as they could if they were not hospitalized, I think there's also a growing potential to say, well, why don't we optimize the availability of daylight or the availability of a normal light-dark cycle? Of course, all of this, in the standard paradigm, one would have to run trials, clinical trials, whether this makes any difference. But I think, hopefully you'll agree, I think there's an intuition to say, well, it's, if you're in the built environment, of course, you want to, in some way, emulate or have similar conditions as you would, as outside. I think the other perspective that's interesting in global health is, of course, when we're thinking about light exposure, I think a lot of the discussion is driven by data that come from mostly Western countries. Yeah. And so this is...
Western countries from certain latitudes, right?
Exactly. So Western or Europe and Northern America, right? So, and I think this is a massive gap in our understanding, because of course the evidence base that we create, which we believe has global implication and global impact, ultimately is from a very selective and biased and privileged population in some way. And so I think where I would like to drive a little bit is this idea of, daylight has different value in different contexts, in different cultures, in different countries. Yeah. And, it's hard to then say, when we, for example, build guidelines for light exposure, how do we build this into this diversity of human experience, this diversity of human behavior? How can we represent this and really bring it into advice, for example?
And I think you just touched a very, very interesting topic, because the truth is that a lot of the new paradigms in research come from, I don't like this term, but let's just say the global north, simply because there's more research funding sometimes, right? To get research in Guatemala is really hard, but partnerships like the ones you can find through the Daylight Academy really make it easier for underrepresented countries and scientists from countries like ours to come and have these conversations and maybe introduce new questions. Mm-hmm. So I think the way to build what you're saying, if we want to talk about a global health paradigm shift that includes daylight and circadian health and all of this, the first question people are going to ask us is, for whom do you speak, right? Mm-hmm. What latitude? Because sunlight and exposure, and sometimes in my neck of the woods, in the tropics, people think more about, too much daylight and all the negative effects. But the truth is we're having the same problems now with urbanism and really crowded cities and slums with no access to daylight. You have the same problems as maybe other latitudes that don't get enough sun during the year. But the question is, until we have research teams that have more global representation, I think there's always going to be a missing epistemology. So how do we create an ecology of knowledge systems, like this diversity and vibrant variety? And I think I've seen it more and more over the years. The first time I came to the DLA in 2021, I think I was the exotic fish maybe, and there were others. But now it's more common to see people from different parts of the planet. And it's so amazing to see the questions being asked come from different experiences of the world. And I think that's what makes rich, like what we're trying to do now with the societal topics. The more we have different disciplines and different latitudes coming together, the more this collective intelligence becomes a microcosmos of the planet, like really representing different interests. And I think then the DLA will have more impact in pushing the envelope in policy and pushing the envelope not only in research, right? But how does our research become relevant for society? By having relevant conversations that more diverse views can come together, So I think that's really cool about this space.
I think it's really powerful, right? I think this idea that, I think, let's put it this way, I think you could spend a whole career creating luxury solutions for luxury problems, right? Yeah. And I think you would miss a lot of the core of human experience, which is ultimately, it varies so much. I think there's something in here which is, I guess what interests me is kind of course, there's many researchers out in the world, I don't know how many, and some of them are interested in daylight, and then some of them are part of the Daylight Academy and are willing and keen to have these conversations, right? And so I every time I come to the Daylight Academy annual conference, I leave with lots of ideas, lots of new ways of thinking about my own research as well, and its place and its context and so on. But these are, I mean, the conversations sometimes are not easy, right? Because not only are you crossing different disciplines, you're also crossing different paradigms of thinking. And so it is rewarding. And it's rewarding because it is kind of hard work, right? Like it's, I think because you need to find a common vocabulary to talk about daylight, to talk about outcomes and outputs and the things that really matter to you in your own discipline or in your own context. And so I guess what I'm interested in is when you're looking at the Daylight Academy, where do you see a gap in knowledge or representation of disciplines? So, you know, I'm a psychologist, neuroscientist, you're a medical anthropologist, we have lots of architects.
Yeah.
Who do you think would, in these conversations, bring something else to the table that would elevate the conversation even more?
Well, I think there are lots of disciplines. If we really talk about global health, I think epidemiologists are missing. Mm-hmm. I've worked with really wonderful epidemiologists from Europe, Switzerland, Guatemala, and all over. And their way of thinking is also, you know, spread over space and time. Mm-hmm. And they have to factor in so many elements about the spreading of diseases that I think it comes more naturally to them to think about the effects of daylight, either in positive feedback loops or negative feedback loops about the spreading of illness. And let's consider the word illness broadly. Mm-hmm. So everything, mental illness, and not only the typical epidemiology concepts of, viruses or bacteria, sure. Infectious disease. So I think that that group of people could be very interesting mm-hmm. to have a conversation with. Because as I've worked with them developing community surveillance and response systems to prevent outbreaks of any kind, naturally a lot of the questions come that put them almost in the same space where we are, mm-hmm. where we're asking, what am I not seeing? So that's one of the clever things about the people here. They seem to have in common this thirst for asking, what am I not seeing? Mm-hmm. And what am I going to learn from Manuel today? And what am I going to learn from Michael or Heinrich or, mm-hmm. Anna? And that's the beauty here is I feel all the disciplines represented here are like one little face of a prism. Mm-hmm. So like a diamond. And you can reflect your knowledge and the part of the light that, hits you. But the complexity of the whole thing we'll be able to understand if we have those other disciplines here. So I think we're still missing sociologists as mm-hmm. well, mm-hmm. a bit, in understanding more. I mean, anthropologists are great, I love anthropologists. But we also tend to look at the construction of culture in a very different way, where sociologists are sometimes really well equipped to understand this sudden shift to urban living and the challenges of a modernized world. And I think having more sociologists would also be very interesting in how do we understand and shape a new comprehension of well-being and the lack or excess of daylight, how it shifts, how it shapes our experience mm-hmm. of health or illness. So at least those two, I think. But to be honest, the more conversations I have with other people here in the academy, the more I think that all disciplines can contribute mm-hmm. something, because we live in a complex system. Mm-hmm. And I never thought that I would be working with architects mm-hmm. in a health project in Guatemala. But they bring this amazing view of the built environment, and they understand the environment broader than I thought. I thought it was buildings. No, it's like everything. Mm-hmm. And the landscape and the shifting of elements in the landscape, and how can that create a wealth of health or not? And so if I hadn't met Hubert, for example, I would have missed out on all of that richness that is now an actual project in Guatemala. You know? So he's helping us build the Mesoamerican Institute of Indigenous Ethnomedicine with this view of how can we introduce this concept of daylight in the way we create the buildings, in the way we create the medicinal plant gardens. How much, not only how much light is necessary, but what is the perception and the concept of well-being when you're inside and outside. And the most beautiful part about it is to see how permeable he was about not only bringing his knowledge from architecture, but sitting down for 7 days in Guatemala with a group of indigenous healers and elders and listening, deeply listening for 7 days, how they view light and what is expected in, for example, a classroom to teach about health and medicine in the Maya way. And he started to shift his own perception of what would the blueprints look like, what should we be building? Because I think there is this characteristic in the group of people that, you know, get clustered here of really asking that question, what am I not seeing, what can I learn? And I think that is unique. Manuel, I go to a lot of conferences all over, that's not common, that the cultural humility to listen.
Of course. I think this is the power, right? I think the everyone here is here because they know that their discipline cannot answer the questions that they're really asking just by itself, right? Yeah. And so I think it requires a certain flexibility of mind, I think, to say, this is the system in which I operate, these are the paradigms that I apply, but really I know this is one of many approaches that I can follow. And there's other approaches that are probably looking at the same way, but the same thing, but through different entry points. And I think from a I think in a way it's really sort of a microcosm, I think, of what knowledge generation and synthesis can really be. There's so much more than what we usually think about and how we think about it.
It is willingness to be uncomfortable.
Exactly, and face the uncertainty of, I don't know anything about this, but I believe there's something that I would like to learn.
Yeah. I think that is unique and promising about all this setup, for sure.
So I think what I would love to do is understand typical light exposure in Guatemala, because we have been collecting data sets here in Munich, in Tübingen. We are working with people in Ghana as well, and so this already broadens our perspective. But I'm quite interested to understand, in a culture with your indigenous populations where daylight is used for healing actively. How does that translate also to into day-to-day behavior? And I think here we have, of course, if people working a 9-to-5 job, for example, there's very limited opportunities, I think, to actively seek out daylight. Yeah. Maybe on the commute to work, maybe walking to the cafeteria at lunch. But I'm quite interested in sort of the behavior of light, right? And I think we're interacting. It's an important aspect of the environment that always surrounds us, whether it's there or it's dark. And so I was wondering if you, what you think about sort of this behavioral dimension, which will be culturally incredibly different.
Yeah, and I think the tendency is to cluster everyone in the same bag and say, oh, Guatemala is like this. And the truth is we're a plurilingual, multicultural country with 24 languages, 24 ethno-linguistic groups. And of course, that means also that our own behavior along the lines of, culture and the ecosystems where we are born shape differently. Our relationship with sunlight and what we think is good or bad. If you come to the city, pretty much the city of Guatemala would be like the city of Mexico or the city of almost any megalopolis in the world. It's huge. And then the contrast is really stark with when you go to the rural areas. And it's very different if you go to a very indigenous area or a more of a mestizo area. Mestizos, people like me, we're a mix of everything. And so our culture and what we deem as valuable is very different. So the microcosmos that Guatemala is, it's sometimes I feel it's like a little fractal of the world, because you have everything in there. We have at least 7 biomes. So we have desert, ocean, highlands. We don't have snow, except in some high volcanoes. But the point is that you can really see the relationship with sunlight very differently in each area. And yet, the one common thing from Maya epistemology is the sun is sacred. Kinich Ahau, the conception of the god sun, is really from pre-Hispanic times. The oldest texts we know, even from Olmec times, Maya times, it's always positioned the sun as the giver of all life. So even in the prayers today, the prayers in ceremonies always start with Ukushkach, Ukushuleu, Ukushkach, Ukushya. And so the point is Father Sun, who gives all of the energy that creates life, and Mother Earth, who also nurtures us, and the wind that is our breath, and the water that is our blood. And so all of these elements are summoned, but always starting with Father Sun. And so it's no wonder then that corn is the main staple food in all of Mesoamerica, and it's the same form of God. Let's call it something, because it's not really a pantheon. It's a conception of different expressions of the one God. But the corn as the sustainer of life is directly related to sunlight. And so even the evolution of teosinte into corn, biologically speaking, in all of the Maya stories is shaped by the amount of sunlight the plant is receiving. And it is considered the one food in the planet that collects the most amount of sun particles to nurture our body well. And so you can imagine, from a culture that regards the sun as so important, the relationship to sunlight is different. Like in all the communities where I've worked, when you rise up before the sun comes out, the first thing you do is bless the morning for the new sun coming up. Like, oh my God, the sun came out today. You never take it for granted. Thank you. And all of the activities during the day mention the sun being able to nurture the land and the plants and our kids. And the behavior is amazing, because of course there are times of the day where you rest, like when the sun is, we say right in the middle, you take a bit of cover because it's burning. But the culture is set up so that at the times you eat, at the times you stop, it's exactly when you shouldn't be directly under the sunlight. So the culture over 2,000 years created these mechanisms to coexist with the sun positively, right? But that, with migration and cultural change, has been shifting. And if you go to the periphery of the city, in all of these slums, the conditions are pretty bad. So you can't even see the sun coming up sometimes, right? So that's why I'm saying the microcosm of all. But I'm guessing it's the same anywhere in the world, right? That you can see this huge diversity of experiencing sunlight and what you would like to have.
I think what's interesting there is this idea of having, I think as researchers, but also I think just as part of our human experience, to embrace the diversity, right? And I think try to understand the multiple perspectives and the plurality really of what we can know and how we know things. When you mentioned, I think the specific behaviors that depend on the position of the sun, I think this is really interesting, because it shows that, of course, there is a component in which the environment and daylight really shapes what we do when. And that, for me as a biologist or chronobiologist, I think is immensely fascinating, because it is this interface between maybe physiology and also behavior, and then on top of this, culture and the environment that you're in. And so, of course, that you cannot just understand through the lens of chronobiology. You will need to zoom out and say, how do we understand these patterns of behavior? How do we understand this systematically and as researchers?
Yeah. I think it brings really interesting questions when you really start observing different things. we were noticing, for example, that elderly people tend to stay inside the house more because it's harder to walk. But there is this rule that at least once a day, a family member has to bring the older person to a specific time of day. So it's either in the early morning or when the sun is setting. But at these two specific times, there's even a term that means your sunbath. Because it is believed that if you want your grandfather to die quickly, which is a really bad thing to imagine, but it happens, then you don't expose him to the sunlight, because that's the source of life. And they start to get the diseases in the skin, and but there's even special canastas, so weaved seating places where you bring the elderly who cannot work anymore to take the sunbath, because it heals the skin, it improves the mood. And so all of these are things that the culture does in a way to honor that relationship with sunlight, But sometimes in the city, when people move to homes that are not designed properly, and they are in like these little like dungeons without any chance to even look at the sunlight, at the daylight, it's kind of, what are the effects of that? Do we even ask that question, right? In our current health paradigm, at least in Guatemala, I don't see our government architects designing with that in mind.
And I think this is where it is, again, an interdisciplinary endeavor, because of course we can generate the knowledge, we can look at customs and culture, but ultimately, I'm not an architect, I don't build buildings, and so the conversations that we can have here are really the ones that, this knowledge that we have, we can create value from this and support health really at a global scale.
And I think that's the promise and beauty of these spaces, right? You do what you do best, Manuel, so you can bring in all of this knowledge that even I would like to have in Guatemala. All the research that you do, I would really like you to have a project with us, because it will train our students, our new generations, into thinking in those terms, so that that concept of circadian health, and it's not currently in anything we research, right? And therefore, of course, it's not in public health discourse.
Of course,
It's not in any of these schools or buildings, and So I think that these collaborations between different disciplines and countries and cultures can really be a win-win situation for all of us.
Absolutely.
You're further ahead in a lot of topics, and maybe we have others that interest you. And so this exchange to rethink global health and the role of daylight, it's promising.
100%. I think there's a lot ahead of us.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this conversation.